Hello, everyone. Welcome to another awesome professional development talk from the Teaching and Learning Center. Thanks so much for inviting me here. I'm really excited to share. My name is Alex McVeigh. I am the director of the K-State Debate Program. I'm also a co-director of the Institute for Civic Discourse and Deliberation here at K-State, Civic Discourse and Democracy, sorry, at K-State, part of the A.Q. Miller School of Media and Communication. And I'm really excited to share with you all a presentation today about debate across the curriculum. Let me make sure that I get my screen shared here. Whoop, Can, can everyone see my screen here?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, to give a brief roadmap of where we're going, I'm first going to lay out the case for why I think debate is so integral and why you can use debate in your classroom to develop some core skills and competencies that I think are crucial for contemporary education. I'm then going to lay out an argument for why I think this is particularly important in AI proofing the classroom. I'm then going to talk about a few of the core skills that I think debate helps you develop and sort of provide a little bit of more granular detail on how to get those skills across, some of the kind of overview of the theories behind why these skills are so important and how to implement them when thinking about debates in your classroom. And then I'm going to offer a few suggestions for in-class debate formats. These are all formats that I have used in the past in debates. These are things that I think easily translate into other classrooms and that you might find some interesting ways to uh, pick up, borrow some of these formats, take what works for you, leave behind what doesn't work, and see how you might be able to implement this in your own classrooms. So the first big thing that I want to discuss is why debate? Why is it that debate is a helpful framework for education? A lot of this goes back to a concept from ancient Greek sophistic philosophy called dissoi logoi. So the sophists were a group of ancient Greek philosophers who went around teaching people the art of public speaking. And one of the core sort of civic competencies that they wanted to develop in people is this idea that if you want to defend a position, it helps being able to defend the opposite position, to take the other side of an issue in order to help develop your own advocacy skills. If you want to figure out what the pros and cons of a position that you are defending are, it's best to take the opposite side. And similarly, by learning to adopt the position of those that you are arguing against, you can learn the strengths and the weaknesses of an argument, which both has a sort of tactical value in terms of it teaches you to be a better arguer. It helps you know what are the strongest positions that you need to be able to answer. It helps you learn about where the weaknesses of your arguments are and your opponents are. But it also provides some core civic skills, some skills that you have as a citizen and as a human being, such as critical thinking. And so when we engage in debate in our classrooms, when you encourage students to take both sides of an issue, they're required to adopt the perspective of another human being, to challenge their own biases. And so for all of the activities that I'm going to suggest later on, a big suggestion that I have here is that you build some kind of way to challenge students in terms of what side they're going to take. So a thing that I like to do sometimes is I will ask students what stance they have on an issue, and the kind of like thought there is that then they're going to get to defend that side of the issue, and then I will make them defend the opposite from the place that they're at. And so if you're kind of doing a scale of like, you have to pick a 1 through 5 ranking. 5 is agree, 1 is disagree, and you can't pick the middle. Whichever end students end up on, make them defend the opposite. Or another thing is like, this is what a coin flip is great for. So if students are preparing for a debate, they need to prepare to be able to defend both sides of the debate. And then you do a coin flip before the debate to figure out which side they're going to be on. That way that they will have known beforehand that it could be either side that they have to go onto. Another reason why debate is such an important skill for the contemporary classroom is media literacy. Um, a big part of debate is evaluating the sources and arguments that are being used in a debate round and learning how to critically evaluate sources, looking for bias, and then searching for expert consensus or dissensus. In other words, are there places where the experts about a topic agree? And then are there places where the experts disagree? That's a really important media literacy skill that I think, I'll talk about this a little bit, but can really help us in the sort of contemporary information environment. Argument evaluation is another incredibly important skill. Learning about argumentative fallacies like correlation versus causation, learning about induction and deduction, which is a skill I'll talk about a little bit, and how to support argumentative claims with data and warrants really provides students with the kind of background knowledge. I often describe this as learning to see the Matrix. So if you've seen the film The Matrix, there's kind of the world that exists in the simulation, but at a certain point, Keanu Reeves's character gets so good at navigating the simulation that he actually begins to see the ones and the zeros behind the simulation. And that's kind of when you learn about the process of argument, you start taking claims that when we encounter them in our syllabi, they may be claims that are being made by an author who they are reading or claims by a public figure. And when you learn to start seeing the reasoning and the warrants and the data behind these arguments and how those things fit together, where common argumentative trade-offs are, it's a little bit like seeing the matrix behind the discourse that makes up so much of our epistemological reality, the truth worlds that we are living and occupying when we are doing academic research or research about critical public issues. And then finally, public speaking, just being able to get students up talking, taking the concepts that they're learning about in class, being asked questions about them, and then having to defend their positions is an incredibly important skill. I often say that I have never been in a job interview where I found myself unprepared, partially because I've spent so many years doing debate training and because somebody can ask me a question about something and I'm pretty comfortable sort of automatically picking up some kind of thread, finding some relevant connection, and developing a position publicly. And teaching students how to do that about the things that they are learning about in the classroom, right? This is sort of that thing that you hear that if you really want to be able to learn something very well, learn how to teach it. Similarly, if you really want to learn a concept very well, learn how to debate about it. Learn how to speak about it publicly so that it's not just something that you're internalizing, but that you have a little bit of practice externalizing that with your voice. Um, I wanted to provide this quote that was in actually the Dallas Morning News about a week ago from J. Scott One, who I believe J. Scott One is the executive director of the National Speech and Debate Association, and Stefan Bouchard, who is for a long time a coach at Harvard Debate and now does a bunch of stuff about AI in the classroom and the relationship to debate. But I love this quote from them. We can bring the rigor of speech and debate into every classroom, not as an extracurricular luxury, but as a core part of developing the practical, in-demand skills employers increasingly seek. Critical thinking, rapid problem solving, ethical reasoning, the art of persuasion, the ability to communicate with clarity under pressure and collaborate with teammates. These are not skills that can be automated. They are learned by doing, by holding your ground at a podium, thinking quickly, and being held accountable by peers and judges. And that is part of the reason why I think that debate can be a crucial part of AI proofing our classroom. Now, I want to pause here. When I say AI proofing, I don't mean that this is like a silver bullet, a panacea, that this is going to solve all of the issues with generative AI, with students using artificial intelligence to replace some of the thinking that they are doing. And certainly this is a thing that even debate educators are struggling with about how do we navigate this when students start bringing ChatGPT and LLMs into the production of debate arguments. But I do think that debate in many ways insulates against some of the worst tendencies of artificial intelligence, and it encourages even those students who might be using artificial intelligence to do research in classrooms to take a step beyond that and to start digging into the why and the how of information rather than just information at a certain level. I think that one of the biggest reasons for this is that debate incentivizes complex epistemological operations. Epistemology here just being the study of knowledge. How do we come to know what we know? Um, Artificial intelligence is very good at producing information that appears on its surface to be credible. What debate does, when students take a stand on a position and they know that they are going to have to, excuse me, debate against a prepared opponent who is going to challenge the information that they are presenting, they are incentivized to say, okay, is the information that I'm presenting actually credible? If it was produced by artificial intelligence, where did it come from? How did it get the reasoning that it came up with? And to fact check, is the thing that AI came up with actually credible? Do other experts agree with this? Are the sources that it came up with real? Can I find those sources? These are the kinds of complex questions that debate encourages students to ask. A part of what AI is doing to learning is that it's black boxing the why behind argument. It creates text without asking the why did it get there, whereas debate exposes that to rigorous evaluation. In debate, it's not enough to prepare one side of the issue. Once you've prepared one side, you then have to find the flaws or weaknesses in that argument and then prepare refutation. And this is like once you start seeing students do this, excuse me, it's one of the most magical moments of like I always say that like I love watching the when you can see the moment when the gears start to turn for students. Like that's one of the most magical and rewarding moments for students. And I see this happen so often in debate when students are preparing an argument and then they realize that the argument that they're preparing has three common responses that people might make to that. And so they need to start refuting those responses to their argument. And then when they get to the next level of like, okay, hold on, but the person is going to have another speech after that, and they're going to have responses to my responses, that's the kind of critical testing of ideas that really invites students to go beyond the surface level of knowledge creation and get into what we call iterative testing, when each different iteration of an argument, especially if you have the ability or the luxury to be able to run multiple debates with the same participants to where they get to be on both sides of an issue, that is where you start to get to that second level of knowledge testing that really helps create a shield against some of the shortcuts that AI is allowing students to take in the classroom. I also have cited an article here, and this most of the ideas that I have here today are not my own. That there are a lot of other debate educators that are, you know, have been working on what the importance of debate is in an era of AI. And this article from Brett Bricker and Jacob Justice in 2025 was really good at talking about some of these epistemological claims, but also empathy, that the idea of taking on the perspective of another human being, having to try to get into the mind of another person to understand where they're coming from or why they think the way they do, is a kind of emotional competency that makes people human communicators in a fashion that we need more of in an era of artificial intelligence, when so much of our thought processes are being automated. Taking that difficult step of getting into another person's mind and seeing how they think is a really important skill. And I just had a quote here from the Bricker and Justice article. Artificial intelligence can allow debaters to find occasionally reliable answers to important questions, but it cannot help them understand the process by which that answer was generated. By contrast, debaters can seek and process information, formulate answers, and defend these arguments raised by sharp-witted and highly motivated human opponents. And one of the things that I love about that is like debate is one of those things that when you assign students the task to do this, it really motivates them to take their knowledge to the next level. The idea that, in a week, I'm going to have to get up in front of my peers and defend my ideas, and that there is an audience that is waiting and that will evaluate, and an audience of my peers that will evaluate me on the things that are going to be said. That really provides an incentive, a motivation for debaters to really buckle down and figure out the intricacies, excuse me, the intricacies of what is going on in the classroom. So we've talked about why debate. I now kind of want to provide some of the core competencies that debate develops, and to get you all thinking about, all right, what are kind of some of the pragmatic steps of how do I go about actually teaching people how to do this? And first, and one of the most important skills that I think debate can develop is a skill that we call line by line and a note-taking system that we call flowing. This is sort of like the most, at its most fundamental level, the flow and the line by line is the blueprint of any given debate. It is the structure, it is the map for a debate round, it is how a debate takes place. And so I've got on the right-hand side here a picture from NSDA, the National Speech and Debate Association's Big Questions Judge Training. And this is what we call a flow. It's a piece of notepaper where arguments take place in columns. And so you can see on the left-hand side of the screen is the negative team, written in I believe that is black ink, although they've got blue up at the top. But for the most part, it's black ink. And then affirmative in a column represented in red. And then the negative again represented in black, the affirmative represented in red, so on and so forth. And so the debate begins on the left-hand side of the sheet. And there are arguments written down in column. So this probably is about framework as overarching control over actions, something about modern physics. So this is some kind of debate about quantum physics. Even without kind of knowing what's going on there, I can see that they're reading pieces of evidence from authors such as Harrison, who talks about classical physics and the observation of human observers. Experimentation at the quantum level shows determinism is false. Koch, uncertainty principle, the universe is random and not determined. So these are arguments that are being developed, and you encourage debaters to write their opponent's arguments down in a column. And in the next column, you write down your responses to the arguments. Now, you'll notice on this flow that not all of the arguments are being developed throughout the entirety of the debate. There are some arguments that maybe you will not need to respond to because you and your opponents agree on those principles. But other parts of the debate get more robust, in-depth responses. And you can see kind of down there at the bottom, whatever is going on in that part of the debate, the affirmative had 3 different responses to that third contention. And then, of course, the negative then has to respond to those contentions. Going line by line, figuring out what your opponent says, and then creating argumentative responses to each part of that develops a few core skills. One of the big ones is note taking, right? There's a reason why debaters end up being very good note takers in class, is because they learn how to spatially conceptualize their notes, how to come up with shorthand, and also how to be a good listener, how to listen to someone's argument. And I think that like sometimes listening in the context of debate gets a bad rap. That the idea is that, oh, well, you often hear people, it's like, well, they're just listening just so for their next response. You're not really listening to what somebody has to say. As a debate coach, I say listening so that you can respond is one of the most intense and in-depth kinds of listening that you can do. Because if you're not giving a fair shake to your opponent's arguments, if you're not hearing its intricacies, if you're not giving it an empathetic ear, then the likelihood is that you might be missing part of what your opponent is communicating to the judge, to the argument evaluator, to the person who is on the other end, who is going to receive this. And so, really listening for the intricacies of the argument, its strengths, is a crucial way to help prepare your arguments. It also helps you make sure that you don't miss any crucial arguments. There can be a tendency for people to sort of not engage with the substance. And I think that's one of the things that sort of frustrates people when they see political debates nowadays is that there's not a lot of engagement, that we often describe this as like two ships passing in the night. The flow, the line by line, is one of the things that helps debaters and can help your students in the classroom ensure that arguments actually clash with one another, that ideas are being tested. A metaphor that I often use is the metaphor of the fulcrum, right? And mathematics, or physics, you've got the idea of a lever that has a fulcrum. And I often talk about debates in terms of argumentative fulcrums, that there are certain hinge points where you need to refute a particular argument in order to have those sides of the debate weigh against one another. And when part of the debate goes up for one side, it might go down for the other. And so the other side knows that they need to put pressure on a particular point of an argument because that's kind of the hinge point or the fulcrum of where an argument lies. I've kind of given you kind of like a little bit of the basics, but if you're interested in learning more about how to flow a debate and how to do some of these line by skills, I've got a video link here and I'm happy to share this with the TLC so that these slides can become available. But also if you just, do a YouTube search for how to flow debates or line by line in debates, you will find all sorts of helpful video resources from debate educators about how to do this. And teaching this kind of note-taking skill really encourages that kind of iterative testing that I was talking about, the skill of being able to take an argument and break it down according to its component parts, to challenge it, to refute it, and then to have refutations to the refutations, to weigh arguments against one another, to determine what matters and what does not matter in a debate. Line by line and flowing is one of the crucial skills that students can learn from debate. Another core skill is the skill of logical reasoning. Logical reasoning is great because this is one of those seeing the matrix kind of moments that I talked about. That once you start breaking down arguments and once you do enough argument evaluation, you will notice that almost all arguments form some kind of pattern of either beginning with particular examples and particular pieces of evidence, and then trying to find the broader principle behind that evidence, or starting with broad principles and then testing them against particular points of data or particular claims. This is the movement between inductive and deductive reasoning. So inductive is when you begin with specific pieces of evidence, and then you find the broader principles behind the evidence. The example I always give of this is, I'm talking to my students like, okay, I'm looking at a group of K-State students. 20 of you all are wearing Nike, 5 of you are wearing Adidas, 5 of you are wearing Reebok. I can say that generally a lot of K-State students wear Nike. It doesn't mean that all K-State students wear Nike, right? But we use inductive data to try to find what are the general principles behind a given set of evidence. Alternatively, you can begin with deductive evidence all the time. Do you want to figure out if somebody is making a position that is politically conservative or politically progressive? Well, what do we know about conservatism? In general, conservatism favors smaller government rather than bigger government. And so if you want to see, does this politician's principles ally with political conservatism or progressivism? One of the specific principles that you then may test on the basis of that general principle is, what is their position on the role of government? What is their position on taxation? And knowing what you know about the category or set of things, then allows you to question, okay, well, how do certain people fit into or challenge this example? Donald Trump is, a really interesting politician for the way that he challenges some of the modern principles of conservatism, or what we kind of traditionally know conservatism to be. And there's a lot of deductive reasoning that goes on when trying to figure out how does this fit into what we already know about the category or set of things that a given thing belongs to. And this movement back and forth between induction and deduction is such a core part of reasoning. And I think I'll talk about this a little bit, but this happens primarily in cross-examination. When you're looking at an opponent's arguments and asking them questions about those arguments, knowing how to move between induction and deduction is incredibly important. Um, Another core skill of argument is the Toulmin model of argument. Toulmin was an argument scholar who tried to come up with a systematic approach to engaging in argumentation. Any argument has three main parts, and this is a simplified version of his model. His model actually has some other things like qualifiers, exceptional cases. This is kind of the bare bones Toulmin model. Is any argument has three main parts: the claim, data, and warrant. Claim is what is the thing you're trying to convince the other person of? It is a proposition of some kind or other. Data is what is the raw material you're using to reference as support for the claim? What are the facts, the evidence, anecdotes? Data scientists always get mad at me for this because there's the quip that the plural of anecdote is not data. But unfortunately, that's not really how argument in the real world works. Oftentimes, anecdotes are the data that make arguments feel textured. Telling stories is a core way that we convince people about how things happen. They're a key part of narrative analysis and narrative modes of argument. And so anecdotes can be a helpful tool within the argumentative toolbox. I think data scientists have a point here that you often have to look at the data behind an anecdote to figure out what's going on. But again, this is why we have arguments. This is why we have debate. Examples, expert testimony, statistics, facts, etc. And then the warrant is a bridge between the data and the claim. I often call this an inference license. The idea of why it is okay to connect that kind of data to that claim in a given setting. Another way to say this is that there is never an automatic relationship between claim and data, which is why we require warrants to fill in the gap. Why, in this argumentative context, does this piece of data support this claim? And I really like using simple examples to teach claim data and warrant to students because it's one of the easiest ways for people to get this grasp. And then once you begin with simple examples, you can kind of start branching out to politics, philosophy, science. There's a whole bunch of other ways to approach this, but beginning with some simple examples is easiest. So I always love starting with pizza. Who doesn't like pizza, right? Maybe people with gluten allergies. That's neither here nor there. Claim, pepperoni is the best kind of pizza. What kind of data could you use to support this? Well, one piece of data that you might use is that pepperoni pizza tastes the best to me. Now, oftentimes people's kind of first reaction is like, that's not data. You're just stating a personal preference here. But again, if data is the thing that connects if a warrant is the thing that connects the data to the claim, there is a valuable piece of data here. And I often ask students, like, what do you think? And I'll just ask you all in the audience, do any of you all have an idea? What is the warrant that would connect this data to this claim? Let me see if I think Don was putting in a vote for pepperoni pizza here.
I absolutely was.
Does anybody have an idea of what the warrant for this argument might be?
Would the warrant be something like if you're going to eat the pizza, whatever's best for you is a good argument for it or a good piece of data for it?
Yeah, absolutely. Warrant, the quality of food is determined by personal taste. And that's a pretty standard argument that people might make. If you're talking about food, what matters more than whether or not it tastes to you? If something, right, food is one of those things that can be incredibly subjective. And so a subjective argument might be the best one for this particular setting, right? That's why I talked about the warrant as a kind of inference license. In this argumentative setting, it is okay to connect the data to the claim in this particular way. But obviously, some people might not be satisfied with that. And so they could say the data is pepperoni pizza is ranked number one preference by a national survey. What would the warrant be that connects this data to the claim? Anybody from the audience here?
I'm like thinking in a scientific way, like generalizability. If lots of people's personal taste is that, then that gives us some data to show that many people have that same personal preference.
Yeah, absolutely. The best way to determine what foods are good is by asking people what they like. And I think, yeah, you can kind of even push that further, that if you want generalizable data that goes beyond just one person's personal taste, right? If food is a matter of personal taste, then it's not just a matter of your personal taste, it is the matter of many people's personal taste. And the best way to get that kind of information would be through a survey. That in this particular argumentative context, a survey is good data to support the claim that pepperoni pizza is the best. I also like using the example of young adult literature. Harry Potter, I know, Harry Potter can be a little bit controversial right now. We will temporarily bracket any feelings that you have about the author of Harry Potter to just have, use this as an example. You could insert any other book here for what it's worth. Data. Harry Potter has sold more copies than any other book series. The warrant for that might be sales indicate a book's popularity and thus its quality. Now, when I get there, I often like to pause and say, okay, if that's true, does that general principle hold true for other things besides book series, or even for book series? If I've got data that suggests that Twilight was the best selling book series for a certain period of years, does that mean that Twilight is the best book ever? And that's one that easily gets students to be like, no, of course not. Popularity is not necessarily an indicator of quality, right? And so this is where getting behind the like, what is the general principle behind a piece of data can really help you clarify assumptions that are going on about the relationship between data and claims. Let's try this. Harry Potter has the most complex characters in an extremely intriguing universe and poses significant moral questions. That is data about the book Harry Potter. It's not what we traditionally think of as like data, right? But those are facts that you are marshaling about this book, facts or your interpretive facts about the book. What are the warrants here?
So would this be something like the depth of the literature is going to be something that determines the goodness of a book?
Yeah, depth of literature is an important thing to consider when dealing with the quality of literature. A good book, the way that I phrase this is that a good book should provide a complex insight to the human condition while also captivating readers. The point here is that what so often we start with these first two things, right? We start with a claim and then we'll say, all right, well, what is the data supporting that? And one of the things that debate is really good at is getting you to ask that next level question of why? Why does this data support this claim? And in doing so, you reveal assumptions, like core philosophical value level assumptions about a person's approach to the world itself, right? Both of these are valid claims that or valid pieces of data that one could make when making an argument about the quality of something. You could judge it based on its popularity, you could judge it based on its sales, you could judge it based on its complexity, on its philosophical depth, and all of those are valid reasons and insights, but they require taking a peek behind the curtain to see what is actually there. Don says, so the warrant is the mechanism or logic. Yeah, it is the logic, and in particular, it is the logic that often goes unstated that helps us connect data to claims. It is sort of the hidden background between the sort of like the substance of an argument and the facts that you are trying to prove behind that argument. Yeah, absolutely. Um, in most competitive debate formats, there is a structured cross-examination. And I think this is one of the most, like when we're talking about AI proofing the classroom, cross-examination is where the rubber meets the road. And so if you have an in-class debate, I really encourage you to offer a position or a time period within that debate where students can engage in cross-examination. And what I don't mean here is what often happens on a TV show of Crossfire or a CNN debate panel where everyone is talking at each other all at once. And the reason why it really helps to build a little bit of structure into these debates is that this is the kind of debate that we do at K-State. It's called cross-examination or policy debate. And I'll show you kind of what that structure looks like here in a minute. But after the first constructive speeches, when somebody speaks, they might speak for 5 minutes, or, in college debate, we speak for 9 minutes. That person then has to answer questions about what they just said for 3 minutes. And it is the job of one person on the opposing team to stand up and ask 3 minutes worth of questions. And this is like a popular, line in debate whenever somebody is like asking a question back or they're, like trying to redirect. A person will say, hold on, this is my cross-examination. It's my turn to ask questions. And so just providing like a little bit of structure goes a long way to say, this is your time period to answer questions, and you will get a time period to ask questions yourself. I'm reclaiming my time, right, from the congressional debates. Yeah, I like that. And so each speaker has a period to spend asking questions and answering questions. And then that's where those core debate skills come in. Question and defend the reasoning behind your arguments. What are the claims being made? What data is used to support? Is this data warranted? Do you have an inference license for why this data is appropriate in this particular setting? What are the hidden values or assumptions that go into the data that you're using to support a claim? Use induction, deduction. Figure out what the general principles are behind the argument and then provide counterexamples. So, a popular political science theory is democratic peace theory, which holds that democracies rarely ever go to war with one another. And then, when this debate happens in debate rounds, people will then ask, okay, so the United States, right, it doesn't go to war with other democracies, but it goes to war with Iran. It went to war with Venezuela. It went to war with Iraq. The United States has been involved in military conflicts around the globe. Why does if the general principle is that democracies rarely ever go to war, why has the United States spent so much of its history in war? Right? And, people will then counter back, no, it matters whether or not the United States has gone to war with other democracies and other great powers, that there hasn't been what we call great power conflicts since World War II. Right? Really digging into the pros and cons, the data and the warrants behind particular arguments, the general principles and the particular pieces of data that support or deny those general principles. This is kind of that next level argumentative jujitsu that goes on, that cross-examination provides people time to flush those things out. So I want to go over four, I guess I have these sort of listed as three. I have it listed as four, but they're kind of going to be three different kinds of debates. One is a 2 versus 2 policy debate. Another is 1 versus 1, which mirrors the structure of what we call Lincoln Douglas debate. And then we'll talk about a few different types of role-playing debates. So, 2 versus 2 policy debate, and this is what we do at the collegiate level, but I've got this shortened for a classroom because you all probably don't have time to do 9-minute constructives and 6-minute rebuttals and 3-minute cross X's, which is what we do. But this is where you create a policy resolution. So ours this year is resolve the United States federal government should substantially strengthen collective bargaining rights for workers in the United States. The first affirmative then gives a policy speech defending that policy. So, a popular argument is that the United States federal government should establish what's called sectoral bargaining, should create protections for workers across sectors. So like all gig workers can join together in a kind of union, even if they aren't sort of in one workplace, but an entire sector of workers should be able to bargain together because that would improve employer power, employee power. It would strengthen workplace democracy. It would help address wage inequality. It would help address automation from artificial intelligence. They will then present their case. The negative will then cross-examine them. And it's the second negative speaker that does this. And the reason why is that the first negative speaker is getting ready to go. So you don't want them to have to cross-examine. But the second negative speaker, coded here in blue, will ask questions about the first affirmative, and the first affirmative will answer those. Then the first negative will go and they will present a 5-minute speech. No, we should not strengthen collective bargaining rights for workers in the United States because if gig workers all of a sudden have the ability to unionize, they will be able to demand much higher wages. It will reduce flexibility in the workplace, and those wages then get passed on to consumers in the form of inflation. And the biggest threat to the economy is not wage depression, but is rather inflation of goods. And it causes what's called the wage price spiral that causes wages to increase to such a degree that goods have to increase, and then it creates inflationary pressures on the economy. Or it reduces the flexibility that employers have, right? There are all sorts of arguments one could make against sectoral bargaining and unions. Then the first affirmative, who spoke first, engages in a cross-examination. They ask questions of the negative. The second affirmative then goes and they defend their position against the objections brought up by the negative, and they are then cross-examined by the first negative speaker. And then the second negative speaker goes and they develop their own positions. And then there is another cross-examination by that second affirmative speaker. Now things get a little tricky. You will notice in the middle of the debate, the negative delivers 2 speeches in a row. In debate, we call this the negative block. And the reason this happens is that it offers certain strategic advantages and disadvantages to each team. And so the affirmative gets to start and end the debate. They switch positions in the middle of the debate so that the affirmative gets the first and the last word. But in so doing, this first affirmative rebuttal speaker has 3 minutes that they've got to answer the arguments made over 8 collective minutes of speeches. And so it puts a lot of sort of time pressure on that first affirmative speaker to be very succinct, while also really allowing the negative team to develop their arguments in depth in the middle of the debate. But the trade-off there is that the person who gets to talk first, who gets to introduce the subject, and then gets to close it out is the speaker on the affirmative. And so, yeah, there's some strategic advantages and disadvantages that each team gets by doing this structure. You don't have to follow this structure. And another way you could easily do a 2 versus 2 style that doesn't switch the positions in the middle there. This is how we do it in contemporary college policy debate, and it's a format that has worked really well for us. But another format is Lincoln Douglas, which is just if you don't have a big enough class to do this, or you've got, you need a little bit more flexibility, a Lincoln Douglas format is really good because it allows people to go 1 versus 1. So it begins with affirmative constructive. The negative then cross-examines the affirmative for 3 minutes. It then has 7 minutes of negative constructive time, followed by 6 minutes of affirmative constructive. The AF then gets, of cross-examination. The affirmative then gets a rebuttal for 4 minutes. And then the negative gets 6 minutes of rebuttal to the affirmative, but then the affirmative gets to end on a 3-minute speech. And so the thing you will notice here is that the affirmative gets shorter speech times, but the negative gets 2 big chunks of speech in the middle, and the AF gets 1 more speech than the negative does. The affirmative makes 3 speeches and the negative makes 2 speeches. And it's all sort of in an effort to sort of balance out the different competitive sides of the debate. So this is a format that works for 1 versus 1. Now, if all of that sounds really overwhelming, and it totally can be, I've got some other suggestions for some simpler formats that are also a little bit more fun. that I say fun. I like these, super nerdy formats, but it's a lot to kind of teach the structure of a debate like this. These sort of allow for a little bit more flexibility, and these are what I call role-playing debates. These are debates where you assign or allow students to take on the role of an author, a historical figure, or a representative from a group of stakeholders, and then simulate a discussion between these stakeholders. The goal is not just to have a debate, but to have a debate while embodying a particular position that may not reflect the student's own position. So the goal is to figure out what would this person or group have to say about a subject, and how would they argue for their position when it is tested by other key stakeholders. All three of the examples that I'm about to give are debates that I have actually done in classrooms that have worked for real students, not just in competitive college debate, but in actual classroom settings. And these are always a pretty great time. So one that I did this was for a group of students who were in communication for the sciences classroom that we did when I was at UNC Chapel Hill. And we did a stakeholder simulation discussion on climate change. And so we sort of convened like a panel discussion and invited people to take on the roles of the Science and Environmental Policy Project, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Sunrise Movement, Greta Thunberg's sort of movement, climate, radical climate activism, the Heartland Institute, which is a group of climate skeptics, representatives from the nuclear industry, representatives from the solar industry, representatives from the oil industry. And then we asked questions and had a simulated panel discussion. Is global climate change a threat? Is regulation worth the cost? Who wins and loses in a regulatory scheme? An objection that I feel like that people have brought up to me before when I bring up this format is, well, hold on, sis, you're having students take on the role of climate deniers? Yeah, we are. And one of the reasons why is one of the best ways to learn the weaknesses of climate denier arguments is to adopt that position, to learn, okay, what are the argumentative logics that they are using? And then it also makes you a stronger advocate for the position that you might want to argue against. If you know the internal logic that a group is using, it helps you to be able to defend your position against that internal logic. This is one that I used in my rhetoric class, debating the ancients. So on the topic, the good life, I divide students up. One person plays the role of Gorgias, a sophist, likes rhetoric. Another plays the role of Aristotle, another person who defended rhetoric and Aristotle's rhetoric. And on the negative, we have two of rhetoric's famous haters, Socrates and Plato. And so in this debate, and they kind of take the lectures that we have in class on the philosophical arguments for and against rhetoric as a discipline of study, they try to adopt the positions of these philosophers, Gorgias, Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, to come up with creative and interesting arguments for why rhetoric might be good or bad. And then I have each one of them give a 3-minute speech, and then I have the audience kind of discuss and deliberate about this. This one was also fun because if you do it in class, you can have yours, like sometimes we'll say, like, all right, you can, dress up in togas today. I bring in like wine, which was always grape juice and pita chips and hummus. And we have like a little debating the ancient Greeks, right? You could change up the historical theme and do this in a variety of different historical settings, but it also creates some fun opportunities for like some in-class activity stuff. And then balloon debates. Create groups of any size, usually approximately 6 is a good number for this. Have each person choose any historical figure of their choosing, and then draw numbers to see what order people speak in. The situation is that these historical figures have found themselves in a hot air balloon. The balloon is steadily coming down over the ocean. We need to decide who to throw overboard in order to stay in the air. Each historical figure is arguing for their survival. You have each speaker give a 3-minute speech, and then afterwards the audience votes on one person to kick out of the balloon. You could also add a cross-examination in where everyone gets an opportunity to ask one question of the speaker. People who've been voted out then join the voting audience. You keep doing rounds of 3-minute speeches until there's only one historical figure left in the balloon. They are crowned the winner. You could also do this with, on a syllabus, if you've got a bunch of different perspectives from argument, from scholars in your field, one person defends Mearsheimer, another person defends Thayer, another person defends Nair. I'm listing off my list of IR political science scholars here, but insert any number of scholars from your field about why do they get to stay in the balloon? Why are their theories valuable for whatever your field is? That could be an interesting way to do this. There are all sorts of different ways to adopt these to your classrooms, but hopefully what I've done here is provide a little bit of an overview of why these would be valuable things to introduce into your classroom, some of the core competencies and skills that you are looking for students to develop when doing this, and then just some suggestions for formats. My information is, available on the K-State website. I'm happy to come in to, talk to you about how to implement these things in your classroom, to do some more advanced training on these things, or if you've just got ideas for how you might want to adopt some debate skills into your classrooms, please feel free to email me. I'd also just love to hear if this, was something that worked for you. Just let me know, or if there were challenges that you discovered along the way. I would love to hear from you about this. Yeah, thanks, y'all.
Thank you very much, Dr. McVeigh. Please join me in a round of applause for Dr. McVeigh. Yeah, I think it's really cool that balloon debate in particular. I think it'd be a fun one to kind of think about including in some of my classes moving forward. I really appreciated that. Um, Rest y'all, we're going to be putting up a post event survey for you to kind of complete. I want to remind you, have our professional development series Wednesdays at noon, all throughout the academic year over Zoom. We also have these archived on our webpage for you to watch asynchronously later. So please share this with your colleagues. A couple of things to put on your radar. After break, we will not meet next week over break, but after break on March 25th, Christina Von Ittersum from our instructional design team will be presenting, and that's going to be fantastic. So be here for that. Lots of other great events coming up for the rest of the semester as well. Also want to put on your radar that SOTL showcase, we're going to kind of be sharing the innovative teaching practices as well as some research related to teaching and learning. You can apply to present for that. We'll have poster presentations. We'll have oral presentations as well. We're looking to put out that call for proposals pretty soon after spring break. But for now, save the date. That will be Monday, May 11th from 1:30 to 4:30 in Hale Library, room 181, I believe. So we'll be checking that out. But I think that's all we have for today. So thank you so much for all the things that you are doing. And I appreciate it. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.